$211. That's what was in the account. Not a metaphor. Not a round number picked to sound dramatic. $211, an overdue notice on the counter, and a 30-year-old man standing in a kitchen that wasn't really his. It belonged to the bank, technically, for another 4 months, until they took that too. He didn't cry. That's the part people don't expect. No dramatic breakdown, no fists on the counter. Just a strange, flat calm. The kind that shows up after you've been afraid for so long that fear stops registering as fear and starts feeling like weather. Just the climate you live in now. He picked up his phone, opened the Notes app, and typed 4 words that would, in 11 months, be the only line anyone remembered from his story. Never this poor again. Not a plan. Not a system. Just a line in the sand, typed by a man with $211 and absolutely no idea what came next. This is that story. From the outside, nothing looked broken. He had a job. Not a great one, but a job. Enough to make people stop asking questions at family dinners. He had an apartment, even if half the furniture was borrowed and the other half was assembled from boxes. He had a girlfriend who believed, genuinely believed, that things were about to turn around because he kept telling her they were, and because believing the alternative was too heavy to carry. From the outside, fine, getting by, normal for someone his age. From the inside, a slow, quiet drowning that nobody could see, because drowning doesn't always look like drowning. Sometimes it looks like a guy who's just a little tired, a little behind, a little unlucky this month, and then the next month, and the one after that. He'd tell himself the story everyone tells themselves. This is temporary. Things will turn around once the next paycheck hits. I'm not behind. I'm just building slower than other people. And every one of those sentences had just enough truth in it to survive another month without forcing him to actually look at the number. That's the trap nobody warns you about. It's not the crisis that gets you. It's the slow normalization of a crisis you've decided to call temporary for 3 straight years. There's a specific kind of silence that happens when you finally open the banking app instead of glancing at the notification and swiping it away. He'd been avoiding it for weeks, not out of laziness, out of something closer to superstition, like not looking at the number kept it from being real. But that night, alone, phone in hand, he finally opened it. $211. And underneath it, the thing that actually broke something open in him. Not the number itself, but the realization that this wasn't a bad month. This was the average month. He pulled up the last 6 statements, one by one, and watched the same story repeat itself in slightly different numbers each time. Never below 200. Never above 800. A man treading water so consistently he'd mistaken it for staying afloat. I'm not going through a hard patch, he thought. This is just my life now. That sentence should have destroyed him. Instead, something strange happened. Somewhere underneath the fear, a second feeling arrived. Quieter, colder, more useful. Anger. Not at his boss, not at the economy, not at bad luck. At himself. For calling this temporary for 3 years running. Here's what nobody tells you about hitting bottom. It doesn't feel like an event. It feels like running out of a story you've been telling yourself for so long you'd started to believe it. He had excuses. Good ones, even. The kind that would hold up in conversation. The kind that made people nod sympathetically. The job market was brutal when he graduated. His industry paid badly across the board, not just for him. He'd had a rough couple of years. A breakup, a layoff, a stretch where nothing had gone right, and who could blame a man for struggling after a run like that? Every excuse was, in its own narrow way, true. But sitting there that night, staring at $211, a different question arrived. One he'd been avoiding for 3 years because he already suspected the answer. If every excuse is true, why does everyone else with the same excuses seem to be doing fine? He thought of a guy from his old job. Same industry, same bad market, same rough couple of years by anyone's account, who'd somehow bought a house last spring. Not because his circumstances were better, because at some point, he'd stopped waiting for his circumstances to improve and started building anyway, inside the mess, instead of after it cleared up. That was the sentence that broke the pattern. Not things will get better, something colder and more useful. Nobody's coming to fix this. And the excuses, even the true ones, were never going to write a different ending. Never this poor again. 4 words. Typed at 11:47 p.m. in a kitchen that belonged to a bank, by a man with no plan and no idea what came next. Here's what those 4 words weren't. They weren't a business plan. They weren't a New Year's resolution with a deadline attached. They weren't even really hope, not in the warm, comforting sense people usually mean by that word. They were a line, a boundary. The kind of sentence that doesn't tell you what to do tomorrow, but makes one thing absolutely non-negotiable. That whatever tomorrow looked like, it could not look like tonight, ever again. Most people, in that same moment, write something similar and feel better for exactly as long as it takes to close the Notes app. The sentence becomes a small act of self-soothing rather than a real turning point. A private admission that changes nothing because nothing follows it. He almost let that happen too. He almost closed the phone, went to bed, and let the 4 words become one more thing he'd said to himself and not meant. But something kept him from closing the app that night. He read the sentence back. Then he did something that would end up mattering more than the sentence itself. He wrote a second one underneath it. So what do I actually do tomorrow morning? Most transformation stories skip this part because it isn't cinematic. There's no montage here, no dramatic first step. The next morning, he didn't quit his job. He didn't launch a business. He didn't do anything that would make for a good highlight reel. He did something almost embarrassingly small. He wrote down every single dollar he spent that day. Coffee, bus fare, a sandwich he probably shouldn't have bought. Nothing dramatic, just observation. Here's why that mattered more than any big gesture could have. For 3 years, he'd been avoiding the truth of his own numbers because looking felt like admitting defeat. That one small act, writing it down in real time without judgment, was the first time in years he'd actually looked his own life directly in the eye instead of flinching away from it. By the end of the week, a pattern he'd never consciously noticed became undeniable. Small, invisible leaks. Not one dramatic mistake, but 100 tiny ones, each too small to matter individually, together adding up to nearly a third of everything he earned. Nobody had stolen that money from him. He'd handed it away, one unexamined decision at a time, for years. That was the exposure. Not a dramatic villain, just years of not looking. Here's where most people quit, right at the edge of this realization. Because it's easier to blame circumstances than to admit you've been the author of your own numbers the entire time. He sat with that discomfort for longer than felt good. Because underneath the small leaks, underneath the excuses, was a harder truth waiting for him. He hadn't just failed to build wealth. He'd actively avoided the version of himself who would have to build it. The disciplined, unglamorous, sometimes boring man who tracks every dollar, who says no to easy comfort, who does the unremarkable work nobody claps for. He'd been avoiding that man for years, without ever admitting it, because that man sounded exhausting and joyless compared to the version of himself who just wasn't good with money and never would be. But sitting in that kitchen, staring at the leak he'd finally found, a different thought arrived. Quiet, uninvited, and impossible to unhear once it landed. What if not good with money was never true? What if it was just easier to believe than the alternative? That I never actually tried? That question didn't feel like motivation. It felt like being caught. Everything that came next grew out of refusing to look away from it. And then something changed. Not the bank balance. Not yet. Something underneath it. For weeks, he'd been treating this as a money problem. Track spending, cut costs, earn more. The obvious moves, the ones every article tells you to make. And they helped, a little. But the real shift happened somewhere he didn't expect. He noticed that the days he kept his small promises to himself, the tracking, the no on the impulse purchase, the extra hour of work he'd normally have skipped. Those were also, without exception, the days he felt like a fundamentally different person. Steadier, less afraid, not because the money had changed yet. It hadn't, not meaningfully. Something else had changed. His word to himself had started meaning something again. That was the twist buried inside the whole story. The money was never really the problem. The problem was 3 years of breaking small promises to himself so consistently that he'd stopped trusting his own resolve on anything. The debt in his bank account was just the visible symptom of a much older debt. The gap between what he told himself he'd do and what he actually did. Fix that gap, and the money problem became something almost mechanical to solve. Because a man who keeps his word to himself, consistently, in small, unglamorous ways, is simply a different category of person than one who doesn't, regardless of what his bank account currently says. Here's the actual rule, not a metaphor, not a philosophy. The specific practice that changed everything, stripped down to what it actually was. Every single day, one promise. Small enough to be impossible to break. Track every dollar. Or, no unnecessary purchase today. Or, 1 hour of extra work toward the second income he was slowly building on the side. Never more than one rule at a time. Never anything so ambitious it would collapse under the weight of a bad day. and the rule that mattered more than any of the individual promises. If he broke one, he didn't wait for Monday, or the first of the month, or some symbolic fresh start. He restarted the next morning. No shame spiral, no story about how he'd failed again. Just an immediate return to the promise, because the only thing that actually mattered was the pattern, not any single day's performance. That single adjustment, refusing to let one broken promise become permission for 10 more, was the difference between the 3 wasted years and what came after. Not because the rule itself was sophisticated, because he'd finally stopped treating a broken day as proof of who he was and started treating it as one data point in a much longer pattern he was actively building. Month by month, the leaks closed. The extra hours turned into a second income stream, then a real one. The $211 became a number he could barely remember, because it had stopped being the ceiling of his imagination. 11 months from that kitchen, the numbers had changed enough that even he had trouble believing it some days. But here's what mattered more than the balance. The man doing the math was not the same man who'd typed 4 words into a notes app out of desperation. That man had needed a miracle. This one didn't, because he'd become, through 11 months of unglamorous small promises, someone whose word to himself was simply reliable now, in a way it never had been before. That's the actual transformation, underneath the number everyone wants to hear about. Not the bank balance. The fact that he could now trust himself. 11 months in, something shifted that he almost didn't notice, because it happened so quietly. The daily promise. The thing that used to require real, gritted teeth effort, stopped feeling like effort at all. He wasn't fighting himself anymore to track a purchase, to say no to something unnecessary, to put in the extra hour. It had simply become who he was. Not a system he was running, just a man. This is the part nobody tells you about real change. It doesn't stay dramatic. It becomes boring, in the best possible sense. So integrated into who you are that it stops requiring willpower, because willpower was only ever needed to build the identity in the first place, not to maintain it. The kitchen where he'd typed those 4 words was gone now. A different apartment, a different life. But he kept the note, never deleted it. Some mornings he still opened it, not because he needed the reminder anymore, but because it was proof. Proof that a single sentence, followed by 11 months of unremarkable daily promises, had rebuilt an entire life from $211 and a debt he couldn't see past. If he could go back and stand in that kitchen with the man staring at $211, he wouldn't tell him it gets better. That man had heard that sentence 100 times already, and it had never once been useful. He'd tell him something smaller and harder. It's not about the number. It was never about the number. It's about whether your word to yourself means anything. And the only way to find out is to make one small promise, tomorrow morning, and actually keep it. Not the whole plan, not the 11-month arc, just tomorrow's promise. Everything else follows from that, slowly, in a way that never feels dramatic while it's happening and only looks like a transformation looking backward. This isn't a video that ends here. If you're watching this with your own version of $211, whatever that number actually is for you, the rule is the same one that rebuilt him, not a system, not a 5-year plan. One promise, tomorrow morning, small enough that breaking it would be almost impossible. And if you break it anyway, you don't wait for Monday. You start again the next morning. That's the whole rule. Never this poor again isn't a sentence about money. It's a sentence about whether you can trust yourself. Everything else is just the proof that follows.